In the small town of Pineview, nestled among the dense forests of Oregon, life flowed steadily and peacefully. Residents knew each other by sight, house doors were rarely locked at night, and the crime chronicle was limited to petty thefts and occasional brawls of intoxicated patrons in the only bar. But one day, this idyll was shattered. It all began with the disappearance of a young girl, Emily Parker. She didn't return home after her shift at the local diner. The search yielded no results. It seemed Emily had simply vanished. The police put forward a theory that the girl had run away to the big city in search of a better life. Her parents didn't believe it, but were forced to accept it. A month later, another Pineview resident disappeared, elderly librarian George Simmons. Then schoolteacher Sarah Collins vanished. With each new case, panic grew in the town. People stopped going out after dark, locked their doors and windows, and looked at their neighbors with distrust. The police were run off their feet trying to find any clues, but the perpetrator left no traces. It seemed he was a ghost, able to enter homes unnoticed, and disappear just as tracelessly with his victims. Sheriff Mike Donovan, a Pineview native, felt that this was the case of his life. He stayed up nights studying the investigation materials, trying to find a connection between the victims. But it was all in vain. They were of different ages, genders, and social standings. The only thing that united them was that they all lived in Pineview. 6 months after the first disappearance, a mushroom picker stumbled upon an appalling find in the forest near the town. In an abandoned hunting cabin, he discovered the remains of several people. Forensics confirmed these were the missing residents of Pineview. What the detectives saw in this cabin forever changed their lives. The walls were covered with strange symbols. Books on occultism and black magic were strewn everywhere. In the center of the room stood a stone altar covered in dried blood. It seemed they had stumbled into the lair of an unhinged cultist. But the most terrifying thing awaited them in the basement. There they found a real torture chamber, equipped with state-of-the-art technology, surgical instruments, chemical preparations, flasks with unknown liquids. Everything indicated that the killer was not just a maniac, but a real scientist conducting some kind of monstrous experiments on his victims. Analysis of the remains showed that before death, the people were subjected to cruel torture. But what was even stranger, traces of a substance unknown to science were found in their bodies. It seemed the killer was trying to implant something into the organisms of his victims. News of the atrocious find instantly spread through Pineview. Residents were horrified to learn that all this time, a monster had been living among them. Mutual accusations began, old grudges surfaced. The town, once a model of neighborliness, turned into a hotbed of suspicion and fear. Sheriff Donovan understood that he had little time left. Panic was growing. People felt menaced and were ready to take the law into their own hands against any wary stranger. He decided to thoroughly check all the town's residents once again. And then it hit him. He remembered an old house on the outskirts where a strange, quiet man had moved in several years ago. His name was Dr. Alan Price, if he recalled correctly. He kept to himself, rarely came into town, said he was working on some scientific theory. Donovan rushed to Price's house. As he approached, he saw that all the windows were covered with thick curtains, and the yard was in a state of neglect. The sheriff knocked on the door. No one answered. Sensing something was wrong, he kicked down the door and entered. What he saw surpassed his most dire expectations. The entire house was filled with cages containing mutilated but still living people. Their bodies were covered with strange growths, their skin glowing with an unnatural light. These creatures seemed to no longer be human. In the basement, the sheriff discovered a real laboratory. Computers were everywhere, their screens flashing with formulas and diagrams. Liquids of all colors of the rainbow bubbled in flasks. And in the center of the room, chained to an operating table, lay a person. Or rather, what was once a person. His body was completely altered. The skin had become transparent, internal organs visible through it, pulsating in an unnatural rhythm. The creature's eyes were covered with a white film, but Donovan felt it was looking right at him. Suddenly, the sheriff heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw Dr. Price. He was calmly looking at him, as if expecting this moment. "You're early, Sheriff," Price said. "I haven't finished my experiment yet." Donovan tried to reach for his gun, but his body refused to obey. He realized with horror that he couldn't move. Price came closer, his eyes burning with a deranged fire. "Don't worry, Sheriff. Soon you'll be part of something great. I've found a way to take humanity to a new level of evolution. We will become something more than just humans. We will be gods." The last thing Donovan saw before losing consciousness was a syringe in Price's hand, filled with a glowing liquid. Several months passed. The residents of Pineview gradually began to forget about the terrible events. The disappearances stopped. Life returned to its usual routine. Many left the town, unable to live with the burden of appalling memories. But sometimes, on dark nights, people saw strange lights in the forest, and some claimed to hear inhuman screams coming from the thicket. None of the residents could even imagine the nightmare that was about to descend upon their quiet town. Dr. Price's army of mutants was completing the final stage of its dreadful evolution. Leading this terrifying legion was a gigantic, horrifying monster with empty, lifeless eyes. It had once been Sheriff Donovan. Having lost all remnants of his human essence, he had become the embodiment of horror. The fate of this small town would be decided tonight, and the end promised to be bloody.